Out of the car exited 3 people, 1 man, 2 women. All 3 of them had gray sunken eyes. They looked like they hadn't slept in years. The men and the 2 women slammed the car doors and walked down a small hiking trail. None of them said a word as they wandered through the arid landscape. After wandering for a while, the 2 women sat down under a tree in the shadow to rest, but the man didn't seem like he wanted to sit down. He just stood and glared at the youngest of the women, as if waiting for something to happen. It all happened so quick and unexpected. The 2 women didn't recognize it at first. The man who didn't took his eyes off the youngest woman pulled a gun from his waistband and pointed it towards her. With his eyes full of hatred and paranoia, he called her a snitch. Then he laid his finger on the trigger and told her he would kill her. Welcome to Midnight Stories. In some cases, where there is a rough childhood, many manage to break away from the vicious circle made by heredity and environment, and in other cases, the pressure gets too big. That's the case with Terry Childs. He was born in Aptos, a small city by the coast of California, close to Santa Cruz. After the calm 50s and 60s, Aptos became a popular place for the hippie movements and alternative spirits. With this came unknown drugs. Terry was one of his family's 6 children. His father, Gary, worked as a bail bondsman. Terry and his 2 older brothers would later in life meet scary, rough humans through their father's job. You should think their father's job would scare them to live on the edge of the law, but that never happened. Terry and his brother did instead develop criminal and violent tendencies. In 1970s, as a 15-year-old young man, Terry got arrested for the first time. Nobody knows exactly why he got arrested. At the same age, he started to experiment with heavy narcotic drugs and got addicted to them. After this, everything turned out for the worst. He got arrested 2 more times in 1974 and 1976. The first conviction was for armed assault and burglary, while the second was for robbery. While Terry was doing these, call it small criminalities, more dangerous things started to scare citizens in Santa Cruz. Serial killers. Throughout the 70s, notorious serial killers such as John Linney Fraser and Ed Kemper would rule over the Santa Cruz underworld. There was no longer any doubt that the small place had changed drastically since the 50s. The tourists disappeared and got replaced by heavy criminals and murderers. Terry had become a young man at the end of the 70s and had undoubtedly caught the newspaper headlines about many of the murders over the past decades. He had seen many serial killers get arrested and sent to prison, but instead of getting frightened or disgusted, Terry got inspired. He already had a long criminal record, but so far he didn't have any lives on his conscience. This changed the summer in 1979. It was a hot summer day in Nevada, and 32-year-old Rulon McGill was on her way to Reno, where she had a dentist appointment. On her way, she dropped her daughter at her mother's and said she would be back around 7 the same evening. From her mother, it was a 2-hour-long drive to Reno. Roland got her teeth checked, and then she drove by a shopping mall. What she didn't realize was that someone was following her through the shadows. Out in the mall parking lot, Terry Childs sat in his car and squinted out the window. When he caught sight of Roland as she came out from the mall, something ignited in him. He didn't know what it was, but he was sure he had to find out what it was. Therefore, he got out of his car and calmly walked towards Rulon, where she was fiddling with the car keys. Before Rulon could react, Terry pulled a knife from his waistband and held it up in front of her. Terry forced her into the driver's seat of the car before he himself sat down next to her. He asked her to drive to a desert industrial area nearby, and Rulon did as she was told. When they arrived and Terry had made sure no one was around, he dragged her out of the car and tied her arms and legs. He seized the terrified 32-year-old. After he finished, he grabbed the knife again and looked Rulon deep in the eyes. Then he stabbed her as hard as he could in the upper body again and again until Rulon no longer moved. At home in Winnemucca, Rulon's mother was deeply worried when her daughter did not come home when she was supposed to. On this basis, she reported her daughter as missing immediately. It took 3 days for her body to be found at the bottom of a small stream near her car. She was naked and bruised, still bound at the arms and legs, with countless stab wounds in the stomach region. While the police investigated the case, Terry had traveled back to Reno, where he had really come to terms with what he had done. In Aptus, Terry was again using drugs. If it was to calm down his nerves after what he did is hard to say, but it didn't seem like it stopped his lust for doing it again. On November 7, 1979, 4 months after Rulon's murder, Terry had visited his mother in Aptus. Nobody knows what was said, but it had ended in a big argument. It was late in the evening when he passed the car park of a hardware store, where he suddenly caught sight of 19-year-old Linda Ann Yosovich, where she walked through the dark parking lot by herself. Linda was a student in the local college. Terry started to look around and made sure there was no one around. When he got this confirmed, he knew that he needed to calm down his nerves after the big argument he had earlier with his mother. Terry followed Linda until she opened the doors to her orange car. That's when he struck. Terry shoved her inside the car and knocked her unconscious. He sat in the driver's seat and drove towards a lake in Los Gatos. He parked the car in a shadow under a tree before he dragged Linda's unconscious body on the ground. He tortured and strangled her before he stabbed her to death. When Linda was dead, Terry drove the car back to San Jose. Linda's family reported her missing, along with her orange car. Within a couple of days, the car was found behind a hospital. There was no sign after Linda. Meanwhile, when the police were looking after Linda, Terry was well informed about the investigation. He went back to the crime scene to hide Linda's dead body further into the forest. While the police still looked after Linda, Terry continued living his life on the edge of the law. In 1980, he was about to be arrested again, but for armed assault. When he got released from jail, nobody knew that he had committed murders, and in his head, this made him feel he was unbreakable. He stayed calm for a couple of years until he met 28-year-old Joan Leslie Mack. They became friends. She didn't have a place to live or family close to where she was, and Terry knew how to exploit it. October 11, 1984, Terry found Joan in the city of Santa Cruz. Where no one looked their way, he went to attack her. Joan was pushed inside the car and gagged on her feet and arms. Terry drove to Seascape Beach in Aptos, where he dragged her after her hair in the sand. She didn't have the time to scream before he pulled a knife and stabbed her to death without any reason. When Joan was dead, he dragged her dead body behind some bushes close to a popular hiking trail. 5 days later, her body was found after the smell of death and putrefaction started to spread in the area. The police investigated the case but couldn't find any clues that led to Joan's murderer. The more Terry got away with murder, the bigger his ego grew. Terry wasn't the only active serial killer in the location in the 1980s either. The police had their hands full and Terry went under the radar. Terry had a dealer named Chris, and one day they started to argue. Nobody knows what the argue was about, but Terry got angry on him and shot him in the chest, public in San Lorenzo Park. Chris fell down and grabbed his chest. Terry ran from the scene while the 23-year-old Chris bled to death. This death marked a change in Terry's path. Terry was now out of control. Earlier, he had only been killing women. Now he was able to kill everyone. Terry met his new girlfriend in 1985, 22-year-old Melanie Lee Hafford. They were both drug addicts and spent most of their time in Terry's apartment where they got high together. They got many friends in the same circle. Jeannie was 17 years old, and she had run away from home to be with her boyfriend, who was one of the street's biggest drug dealers. But when her boyfriend got arrested for possessing drugs, Terry and his girlfriend let her stay with them. After some weeks together, Melanie and Terry was extremely high on drugs, and Melanie told them her real name wasn't, and Jeannie told them her real name wasn't Jeannie, but Louise. Terry got very paranoid due to heavy drugs and afraid all his secrets would come out, and accused Jeannie, Louise, for being a spy from the police and that she would reveal him to the authorities. This was of course not true, but Terry couldn't let the feeling go away about losing Louise being a snitch. The rest of the evening, Terry was threatening Louise and questioned her about his suspicions against her. Louise did of course deny it all, but Terry didn't let himself be convinced. Whatever she said, he denied, and Terry didn't let Louise be. In a moment when Louise no longer was in the room, Terry leaned over to Melanie and said he wanted to get rid of the teenager. Melanie saw it as a joke and told him to calm down. She said they had nothing to be scared about regarding Louise, so they should let it go. But Terry was determined. When the sun came over the horizon, Terry told them to join him for a drive. He as much as pushed the two women inside the car and told Melanie to drive against Scotts Valley, a small village on the mountains. Almost up to the valley, Terry told Melanie to stop the car on the side of the road. Terry led them from the car to a hiking trail. After walking for a while, they sat down to rest under a tree. All out from nowhere, Terry told Louise he was about to kill her. Louise looked at Terry with wide eyes and a fear in her eyes. She begged him to spare her life, but Terry refused to listen. His paranoia had taken control over his brain, and there was no way back. Terry pulled the gun from his waistband and pointed the gun towards the young girl. Melanie tried to convince Terry to come to his senses, and it worked. Terry placed the gun back in his waistband. Terry pulled out a knife and started to clean his nails with the blade of the knife. Neither Melanie or Louise dared to say a word in case it would make it worse again. Melanie took a few puffs of her cigarette instead and threw it on the ground. Terry told Melanie to pick it up again. Melanie didn't dare to say anything and leaned over to pick it up. Then Terry pulled out his gun and fired 2 shots towards Louise. She was once hit in her arm and once hit in her leg. Melanie tried to escape, but Terry pulled the gun towards her and threatened on her life that if she moved, he would kill. Melanie froze, and Terry turned to Louise again and started shooting. Louise got hit multiple times, but in a miraculous way, she was able to crawl to the ground and away from Terry. Terry came after and pointed the gun to her head and fired. Everything got quiet. Terry and Melanie walked back to the car. Terry advised her not to tell or speak to anyone about what she had witnessed. On the way back home, Terry got rid of the murder weapon in the harbor basin. Louise's body was found by a trail hiker, and the police was immediately contacted. As soon as she was identified, the police turned their suspicions onto Terry. Witnesses had seen Louise in a car, and the police knew exactly who the car belonged to. When they found the car and started to investigate it, they found explosives that are usually made to be used by the army. The explosives was enough to arrest not only Terry but Melanie too for possession of deadly weapons. Not long after, it didn't take the police much time to figure out Terry had a gun exactly the same as what killed Louise. Because of this, September 10, 1995, both Terry and Melanie was now charged for the 1985. Both Terry and Melanie was now charged for the murder of Louise. Now Melanie had nothing to hide, so she started talking and told the police everything that had happened when Louise got murdered. And she promised to witness against Terry as long as the police promised to give her a milder sentence than Terry. The authorities agreed. When the case came up for the authorities in 1987, Terry Child was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Nobody knew about the secrets Terry was carrying. He was now sentenced for a lifetime in jail for only 1 life, but he had way more on his hands. For 10 years, he kept silent about all the murders he did. Until 1997, when he had all of the sudden started to talk. He started to tell the prison officers that he didn't only kill 1 person, but 12. The detectives was fast connected on the case and told Terry to explain more. Terry claimed he had killed in Nevada, California, and Washington. During some years, Terry confessed to 5 murders that the police was able to confirm. Rula McGill, Linda Yosovich, John Leslie Mack, Chris, and Louise Segala was finally clarified. Who the remaining 7 murder victims are, nobody has ever gotten out of him. Terry died in prison February 11, 2023, and if he had more secrets, they also died with him. His life was more or less made for him since his first existing. He followed his 2 older brothers and their cruel and dangerous tendencies, combined with a heavy drug use and serial killers as role models. He turned out to be something much more dangerous. What made Terry kill is something nobody will ever know.